Hello, welcome to the 2019 Guide to Technical Synoptic Assessment. My name is Alison Atkinson and I'm a Principal Moderator for City Guilds Technicals. This presentation is the second in a series of bite-sized webinars which aims to guide and support centres in delivery, evidence collection and marking of the Technical Qualifications Synoptic Assessment. The full set covers the following, and each will illustrate common pitfalls and make recommendations for best practice in centres. In Part 1, we went into the process of delivery of the synoptic assessment. Part 2, this one, discusses the differences in learner-produced and centre-produced evidence. In the next one, Part 3, we give guidance on marking and standardisation. And finally, in Part 4, we discuss the submission of evidence to City and Guilds via the moderation portal. These 4 webinars give general rather than subject-specific guidance. The purpose of them all is to support centre staff in the delivery of any of the City and Guilds technical synoptic assessments. Here we can see in the green circles specific areas which are relevant to learners. The first one being general guidance to candidates. It gives an overview of how candidates approach the assessment and gives them information on timings, planning, health and safety and presentation of work, as well as drawing their attention to plagiarism. Much of this guidance is there to back up what you have already taught, such as submitting good quality work which accurately shows knowledge and skills, and to write things clearly and explain concepts as well as they can. The assignment brief gives the learner the context or scenario for the assessment. It sets the scene for the tasks that they will be required to carry out, making it relevant to them and the technical area that they've been studying. The assignment tasks specify what the learner has to do and the conditions of the assessment. For example, whether they will be supervised, be able to take notes into the assessment, or what they must prepare beforehand. This area also gives information on the evidence that must be produced for marking, so what they must hand in and what the tutor must create. So the learner needs to produce some evidence, often written reports, plans or evaluations. When a learner is asked to carry out a practical performance, it can be difficult for them to create digital evidence of this. In this case, we ask the tutor to produce some evidence in the form of written notes on practical performances, which forms part of the evidence uploaded in the sample. These notes describing the candidate's practical performance are an important way of showing the marker and the moderator what took place whilst they were caring for the animal, doing the hairstyle, painting the wall or servicing the tractor, for example. Without these descriptions of how the candidate performed, it would be impossible to mark the work. Later on in the slides, we'll go through some examples of good and not so good ways of noting practical performances. As we move into the blue shaded circles here, we can see that these areas concentrate on centre guidance. We have task instructions for centres, which gives specific information on that year's assignment and any resources or times which must be noted. Centre guidance also highlights areas such as health and safety and accessibility and fairness. Next comes the marking grid. Each one is different for each qualification, although the 5 AOs are the same. Although they are the same, the weightings in them will be different according to the importance of each in that subject area. And finally, we have forms which are used within the assessment. These range from mandatory City and Guilds documents to those which can be created or edited by the centre. We'll go through each as we go along. Let's look closely at the guidance given to candidates here. They have an assignment brief, something which sets the context for the tasks which follow. They then have the tasks, the actual work that they have to carry out, with information on what to produce for marking and what the conditions of the assessment are, such as can I have help or how much time have I got. The advice on plagiarism should not be a surprise to candidates. They should know that any research sources must be referenced and the wording of others should not be copied and used as their own. It's a good idea to review the structure and format of the synoptic assessments using last year's assessment. What should be focused on? Where are the clues that will help them to understand how to answer the questions? Here we have an example of a task in professional cookery. We can see that learners can take into the assessment their menus and recipes and their completed plan. The task must be carried out independently, and both the tutor and learner must sign to say that these conditions have been followed. Centres should pay particular attention to the task instructions for centres included in each assessment pack. During this year's delivery, a number of centres failed to follow guidance around resources to be used and timings. We can see here this gives specific guidance according to each task, such as resources, photographs which must be taken at certain stages, and the time recommended for each task to be completed. As you can imagine, if a learner is allocated a particularly challenging technique of food preparation, or a difficult animal to manage, or a client with difficult hair, centres should refer to this in the written observation notes to ensure the moderator gets a sense of the conditions the assessment was carried out under. This is the case for any situation that is out of the learner's control. Here we have an example of where the learner could have created better evidence. This tick sheet is very simply stating the steps they took, but does little to show their fuller understanding of the task. Here the learner has produced a plan and a record of the care they have given to an animal. The task required them to create a feeding and health plan. The design of this table was similar to all those seen in the sample at this centre. This table has limited the learner by not allowing them to add their own categories, and it would be difficult to see how two learners completing this might do it differently. This is a missed opportunity to see better or worse performance and makes marking on a scale problematic. Here we have some recommendations for centres and learners. Learners should receive exam preparation for the synoptic assessment, which could include practicing by carrying out shorter formative assessments throughout the year. This will help them to draw together their learning to complete a task or activity. It must be noted that any formative assessments must not be directly related to the tasks in that year's synoptic assessment, although previous year's tasks can be used. During practical activities, encourage learners to justify what they are doing and why. Explaining their approach will build their ability to break down their actions and demonstrate their understanding and skills. This will support them during the synoptic assessment. It's a good idea to review each of the assessment objectives as a class so learners understand what criteria they'll be marked against. Taking into account the AOs, the class could then review the sample assessments to determine how to answer the questions and what knowledge, understanding and skills the learners could bring to the answers. It must be said here that it's not recommended that the entire marking grid is shared with the learner, as the level of detail on marks and descriptors may be misleading. However, there is a description in Appendix 2 of the Marking and Moderation Centre Guide, which allows the centre to convey what assessment objective assesses in a way that's easier for the learner to understand. This will help them to answer questions such as, what are they being marked against? What's the relevant weighting of marks against each assessment objective? Where will they get the majority of marks from? And what are the things that they need to demonstrate to achieve marks for this assessment objective? We're now going to move on to centre-produced evidence. On this slide we have centre guidance, and I'd like to draw your attention to the observation evidence guidance in this section, which gives tutors a lot of detail about how to create meaningful descriptions about the candidate's practical performances. They must describe how well the activity has been carried out rather than stating the steps or actions the candidate has taken. The notes must be very descriptive and focus on the quality of the performance in such a way that comparisons between performances can be made. They must provide sufficient, appropriate evidence that can be used by the marker and the moderator to mark against the set of tasks using the marking grid. Identifying what it is about the performance which is different between candidates can clarify the qualities that are important to record. Each candidate is likely to carry out the same steps, so a checklist of this information would not help differentiate between them. However, qualitative comments on how well they do it and quantitative records of accuracy and tolerances would. The tutor should refer to the marking grid to ensure appropriate aspects of performance are recorded. These notes will be used for marking and moderation purposes, so must be detailed, accurate, and differentiating. We have an example here of poor practice. Here are two excerpts from practical observation forms. Both of these came from the same centre. Not only are they not detailed enough, they describe the performance in a very similar way, but the marks in Assessment Objective 3, seen on the candidate record form, were very different. As you can imagine, this does not allow the moderator to differentiate and validate the marks given to the learner's practical performances. Here is an example of good practice when completing a PO form. The centre have gone into a lot of detail and described the performance in a way that brings it to life for the person who may not have been present during the practical, i.e. the moderator. Although the font is quite small here, you may be able to see that there were two practical tasks in this synoptic. Both of them have descriptions. I've highlighted areas of band descriptors which give hooks to the markers of where to place marks. You can see we have some inconsistencies, awareness of industry standards, skills were adequate. She had to be prompted at times, but showed consideration for the horse's needs. This clearly places the learner in band 2. Going into the details which surround this performance, we can then see justifications and further information which help us to fine-tune those marks. We use the practical observation form to justify marks, and we take this into account when marking the whole set of tasks. It is therefore imperative that you justify the overall holistic marks you give for this AO. It is especially important if the practical observations include a mixed picture of practical performance. So to summarise, we have some recommendations here. Practical observation forms are part of the evidence the moderator must see in the sample uploaded to the moderation portal. They must describe how well the activity has been carried out, rather than stating the steps or actions the candidate has taken. The notes must be very descriptive and focus on the quality of the performance in such a way that comparisons between performances can be made. The information must be detailed, accurate, and differentiating. Take care with the use of language in the descriptions of performance, as it may distort the moderator's impression on the learner performance. Avoid constantly focusing on the positive to encourage learners, or the negative. These documents are not shared with the learners. This is a summative assessment which cannot be changed or resat, so there's no reason to sound encouraging here. These judgments are of the final performance. Centres should pay attention to the function of the different forms. The PO form describes the learner's performance on the practical tasks. The candidate record form, or CRF, will be discussed in Part 3, but should justify the holistic marks that have been given for each AO across the full set of tasks. The approach to completing the PO forms should be standardised and reviewed by peers to ensure that the information contained is sufficiently detailed. Candidates and centres need to ensure that they provide all the evidence that is required for marking as per assessment pack. Here's a tip. Remember, the evidence has to be reviewed by someone who may not have seen the assessment and who is not familiar with the centre approach or the learner. It needs to be completely clear, coherent, and comprehensive. On our final slide, we have some information on authenticity. Tutors must be aware that the amount of feedback or guidance given during the assessment must only support access to the assignment and must not provide feedback for improvement. The level and frequency of clarification and guidance must be recorded fully on the CRF. It must also be taken into account along with the candidate's final evidence during marking. And finally, it must be made available for moderation. Providing feedback on the quality of the performance or how the quality of evidence can be improved is classed as malpractice. Candidates can rework their evidence that's been produced for the synoptic assignment during the time allowed. However, this must be as a result of their own review and not as a result of tutor feedback. Once the evidence has been submitted for assessment, no further amendments can be made. I'd like to thank you for your time. I hope this has been useful. Please watch out for Part 3 in this series of bite-sized webinars.